Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Naomi Jelks. I'm the main library manager, and I'd like to welcome you all to San Francisco Public Library. This event kicks off the library's more than a month Black History programming. Please be sure to pick up the library's newsletter or go to sfpl.org for more information about Black History Month programming. The San Francisco Public Library is pleased to partner with Sister Sci-Fi and present Shadows and Light, exploring Black horror and Black healing. But first, I'd like to thank library staff, without whom this event would not be possible. Please give a round of applause after I finish. I want to thank the AV department for making sure things run smoothly this afternoon. The Sister Sci-Fi work group here at the library. We've got Shauna Sherman, the manager of the African American Center. Rachel Drayden, the librarian for the African American Center. Hernan Acevedo, he's a member of the Racial Equity Committee. And my close assistant, Michelle Williams, she's staff at Noe Valley. De'Ariane Curry Matthews, staff from the Mission Branch. Lastly, I would like to thank the Friends of San Francisco Public Library, whose generous fundraising makes programs like these possible. Quickly, I want to offer a little bit of housekeeping. When you exit the auditorium, if you make a hard left, the restrooms are right over there, so you can, during breaks, you know if you wanted to do a bio break, they're right there. Sister Sci-Fi is selling books in the cafe area. Cash and electronic payments are accepted. I got my awesome t-shirt, there might be some left, and some bags. And please be sure to visit our vendors in the Latinx room. There's lots of great things to purchase for healing and for smelling good. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things off to Isis, Sister Sci-Fi.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Oh my God, y'all are such a beautiful audience. Yes, clap for yourselves. I have the extreme pleasure of introducing author Tananarive Due, who I love to refer to as the Queen of Black Horror. Woo! So many of y'all have read My Soul to Keep. Who's read My Soul to Keep? Yes! That introduced us to the African Immortal series. Then you also have The Good House. You have The Keeper, which is an adaptation by Megascope. The number of books that Tananarive Due has written has gone on and on. But it's not only her fiction work that makes Tananarive Due the queen of Black horror. So Tananarive Due has also executive produced Horror Noir, A Century of Black Horror, which is an adaptation of a book by the same name, which is available on Shudder. And I'll stop here. If you have not watched this documentary, especially now, stop what you're doing, put it in your queue, watch it when you get home tonight. And just helping us contextualize what it means to watch horror as people in America. Her recent book, The Reformatory, is a New York bestseller and has gotten rave reviews and awards. So I'm truly honored that Tananarive Due is here today. Please applaud, and if you're able, stand up and stomp and help me walk. Oh, yeah, no, for real. Y'all are gonna be sitting all day. So welcome Tananarive Due.
All right, y'all now. Thank you so much, Isis. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here at the San Francisco Public Library with a bunch of Black horror fans. Come on now. I am Tananarive Due. I'm not here as an author today. I'm here as a witness. And I'm not here to make a speech today. I'm here to testify. Black horror heals. And we are sorely in need of healing. As I left Southern California yesterday, Parts of Los Angeles County were still on fire. They're still on fire today. The community of Altadena, where science fiction pioneer Octavia Butler was born and raised and buried beside her mother, has been turned to ash around her gravesite, although, according to AP, her gravesite still stands. San Bernardino County, where I live, will be under some kind of severe weather advisory tomorrow when I get home for high winds, which of course is often just a precursor to fire. So even those of us who have been safe from the flames and smoke know that we could share the same fate at the whims of the wind, or an arsonist, or an accident. That is horror. And the threat of everything around you going up in flames, I don't know, for some reason, just seems like such an apt metaphor for where we are right now at this point in American history. These are scary, scary times, but lucky for us, these are the times that horror can help heal. When I was growing up in Miami, anyone from Florida? I know, nobody? Okay. Y'all just don't want to admit it. Okay, yes. When I was growing up in Miami, my late mother, a civil rights activist named Patricia Gloria Stevens Due, sat down with me on Saturdays to watch creature features, the old Universal film classics like Dracula, The Mummy, The Mole People. Anybody else? Am I the only one? The first deep scare I remember is at the end of the 1958 version of The Fly, when the little scientist fly is caught in the spider web going, "Help me, help me." And nobody can hear. Woo, boy, the depths of his inconsequence scarred me for life. Mom also gave me my first Stephen King novel, that shiny paperback version of The Shining, for my 16th birthday, so my love for horror was born. I didn't know then that I wasn't alone, that Black children across the country were also watching movies like Night of the Living Dead, Candyman, Tales from the Hood, with their parents and grandparents, their aunts and their uncles, drawn to horror both to heal trauma and to celebrate representation. Black horror fans' love of horror is the stuff of legend. Theaters and Black neighborhoods carry the well-earned at times expectation that audiences will express vocal frustration, outrage, and joy while they watch their favorite horror films. For years, Black comedians have joked about how Black characters in horror would never rush so foolishly toward the danger. As Richard Pryor famously joked, if a Black family had been in The Exorcist, he said, this is me paraphrasing, I'm not gonna exactly quote Pryor, wouldn't have been no movie if we'd been in it. The movie would have been about 7 minutes long. As soon as the devil spoke, hello, goodbye. Like many stereotypes, there is some truth to this. African Americans didn't survive this long on these shores without developing good instincts for running and hiding. I had a great uncle who was chased out of his Georgia town where he was running a popular resort for Black people after a false rape accusation that forced him to hide in the trunk of a car. I borrowed that in a reformatory, but that really happened to another relative. And of course, the outraged citizens took his land after he was gone. So these kinds of accusations or advances against white women by Black men historically were used as social and economic terrorism, whether it was in Tulsa or Rosewood or the murder of a child, Emmett Till. The nation's first true blockbuster, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation in 1915, helped cement the notion of brutish Black men chasing white women with the noble Ku Klux Klan mobilized to the rescue. And to this day, we are still fighting the impact of those tropes. So at a screening for Horror Noir, a history of Black horror, a couple of years ago, followed by a panel, one of the panelists said, you remember that image of that lynching? That was That was in my family. As the comedian Earthquake often says in his comedy routine, these ain't jokes. The horror equivalent is, these ain't just stories. This ain't random history. To us, this is very, very personal. And after Jordan Peele released Get Out in 2017, I started teaching a class at UCLA called The Sunken Place: Racism, Survival, and the Black Horror Aesthetic. The word survival is a whole sermon to Black people. Horror's primary preoccupation, especially in movies, often simply is survival. Watching characters find ways to survive under the greatest stress of their lives. Like yesterday, you didn't know there were demons. Today, you have come up with a plan to try to fight one. Or if they don't survive, learning from their mistakes, don't fall down. Don't just cover yourself up with a blanket, that only works for kids. Or seeing what it looks like to keep fighting for your life until the bloody end. That's a nutrient I cannot get enough of. Black horror can help us survive, and Black horror can help us heal. The first time I truly felt afraid was when I was 14, at the start of an insurrection in Miami protesting the acquittal of police officers who killed a Black insurance executive named Arthur McDuffie. Does anybody know, anybody remember McDuffie? If you've read, oh my gosh, The Devil in America by Kaya Shanti Wilson, he mentions Arthur McDuffie as one of the cases. I mean, honestly, when I saw Arthur McDuffie's name, it was like that novella reached and grabbed me by the throat. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe he's writing about McDuffie. So basically he led police on a chase. When they caught him, 12 officers beat him to death with those big flashlights, and then they realized, oh shoot, we messed up, and they tried to beat up the motorcycle to make it look like an accident. And they got caught, and there was a huge expose in the Miami Herald. And then they were acquitted after all that. So despite my family being taunted and vandalized after we integrated a South Miami-Dade neighborhood in the mid-1970s, I was never actually afraid for my family's safety until the night those fires blazed. My mother and two sisters were at a protest that had been planned as a peaceful protest by local leaders, got usurped by neighborhood rage. And my father, who worked for Miami-Dade County's Community Relations Board, was out in the streets trying to call for peace and calm. I had felt so sick and weary and stunned after hearing news of that acquittal that I stayed behind instead of going to yet another protest. Anybody else raised by activists? Going to yet another protest with my activist mother. But by the time the movie was over, I went to a movie with a friend. The fires were all over local TV. So the horror was twofold. My mother and sisters were swallowed somewhere inside that violence and chaos. And Arthur McDuffie's death had taught me that police could kill Black people without punishment. Now, I know that seems silly now, but this was my first time realizing it. This was my first Black Lives Matter moment before there was a Black Lives Matter. They could get away even if they were caught lying about it and exposed in the Miami Herald, didn't matter, they could still be acquitted because our lives did not matter. The terror I felt that night cut me to my core. So luckily, my family made it home without injuries, but the damage to my young psyche was done. Like my mother, I learned to find comfort in images of monsters and demons to counteract my true life traumas from growing up Black. My racial awakening was much more gentle than Patricia Stevens Dew's, who grew up during Jim Crow, deeply offended and outraged by the white-only signs that ruled public spaces. She wore dark glasses even indoors for the rest of her life after a police officer threw a tear gas canister in her face in 1960 when she was 20 years old. And at the time, she was leading a nonviolent protest against segregation as a student at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee. I know FAMU's in the house somewhere. I saw somebody. There you go. But Maybe it was Mom's lifelong sensitivity to light after that tear gassing, but her most visible battle scar from the 1960s was that sensitivity to light, and maybe that's what drew her to the darkness of horror. So it's no surprise that she was the first horror fan of my life, and she passed on her passion to me with those old creature feature movies when I was probably, as many of us were, far too young to be watching them. We watched The Mole People when I was about 7 or 8, I would guess. Does anyone remember this movie? I knew it had had an impact on me in childhood, but I didn't remember why. I was like, what is it about that movie? So I tried to rewatch it again as an adult. And for the longest time, I was baffled by why it had stuck with me. It was dull, but then the white explorers in the movie began whipping the enslaved underground mole people, who were allegedly the monsters in the story. Then it hit me. As an adult, even as a child, I identified with the mole people, and I was rooting for their liberation. Instead of feeling afraid of them, I was afraid for them. Black history is Black horror, as I said in the Shudder documentary Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, which was an adaptation of the book by Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman, and she just did a revised edition. If you read it, the 2011 edition, be sure to read the revised edition. Seeing monsters on screen validates our fears because they look like what we are feeling, whether those monsters are sympathetic or terrifying, or both. And watching characters fight to survive feeds deep-rooted drives that can help keep our nightmares at bay. Horror in fiction and movies wasn't nearly as scary to me as coming of age as a Black girl. For my mother, it wasn't nearly as scary as her memories of being tear gassed and jailed, or fearing for the safety of her unborn grandchildren, which she did. She was one of those, she was like, don't feel like you have to have kids on my account. Too many of us, as African Americans, carry stories of hiding and running for our lives in our family oral history. So no wonder so many of us love horror. I never had the chance to ask my mother about the relationship between her trauma and how I believe she used it for healing, and used that horror for healing, but it's so obvious to me in retrospect. Since her death in 2012, my own greatest trauma so far, horror has become more than just that fun roller coaster ride I thought it was when I was young, and more like soothing arms rocking me, validating my pain, whispering, yes, I see. If a horror protagonist doesn't survive, I can feel the satisfaction knowing the story wasn't real anyway, so. And if I'm rooting for the monster like I did watching The Mole People with my mother, I get to feel power I've never had in life. And when I write stories about my own worst nightmares coming true through the veil of horror, I hope I'll give myself just enough strength to vanquish my own monsters. Black horror has definitely risen to the national consciousness. A large part of it, of course, is the phenomenal success of Jordan Peele's Get Out, which came out in 2017, won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, first time a Black artist had won Best Original Screenplay, and his follow-up films Us and Nope. In the 2019 documentary Horror Noir, which was directed by Xavier Bergen, adapted from I'm always going to shout out Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman's name 2-3 times. But her book is called Horror Noir, Blacks in American Horror Films from the 1890s to the present. So there's a long lineage. And it's been embraced by horror fans of all backgrounds for the lessons on the most common tropes around Black characters in cinematic horror, which some of you may be familiar with, the spiritual guide. The only reason we're in the movie is to give advice, pep talks, if you will, to the white protagonist, the sacrificial Negro, who is also sometimes a spiritual guide, who jumps in front of whatever it is that was about to kill said white protagonist. A really good example of that, or I should say a bad example of that, is in Annabelle. And I love the Annabelle franchise, but that first movie, Alfred Woodard, why the hell? If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry, but why? Just why? Why? The magical Negro, very similar to the spiritual guide, but with magical powers. and then the first to die. I mean, we've seen all these tropes. And it's really interesting to me that despite all these tropes, our forebears still loved horror movies. It's like you have to filter it out, pretend you didn't see it in order to get the nutrients. Hollywood basically was projecting white Americans' notions of Black monstrosity or childishness in these tired horror tropes. And I really also think it harkens back to the other tropey character from Birth of a Nation, because you had two kinds of Black people, well, three. Incompetent, like the people who were supposedly in Congress banging their shoes and fried chicken or whatever. The monstrous Black men who were actually white actors in blackface, one of whom is chasing a white woman through the woods like he's literally a bear. And the faithful servant, that faithful servant trope. America has loved that trope. And it's not just in Birth of a Nation. We saw it again in, of course, I just watched this movie, Gone with the Wind. And God bless Hattie McDaniel for the career she tried so hard to have. But she could never break away from the love of that trope of the mammy-type character who is just there to take care of you. Like, wasn't the war over and Gone with the Wind? What was her ass? I didn't see the contract negotiation for her salary staying on after the war. But anyway, I digress. But Black authors and filmmakers have fought back with images and Black protagonists in horror who are strong and brave, and sometimes they even survive, and revealing racism for what it actually is, that true life monster. Television is far ahead of feature films in terms of adaptations of Black horror. We've seen recent adaptations of Victor LaValle's The Changeling, Zakiya Dalila Harris's The Other Black Girl. Y'all, if you haven't seen these, please take notes, because a lot of these are actually on Hulu. And yes, even Octavia Butler's Kindred, which I consider horror. I consider a lot of Octavia's work to be horror, even though it's not categorized that way. My husband, Stephen Barnes, and I had our first short story adaptations that we didn't make ourselves in the horror noir anthology film that also followed the documentary. On the feature front, Nikki Atujusu's Nanny is beautiful and powerful immigration horror, as is Remy Weeks' chilling His House. Isolation at a predominantly white college for both a Black freshman and a Black faculty member serves as the backdrop to horror in Mariama Diallo's Master, which is hard to watch as someone who teaches. It's a little too close to home, actually. I don't even teach that in my class. I think my students are actually dealing with enough of that in real life. They don't need to watch it in fiction, too. But there's also the brilliant blending of comedy, horror, and Black history in Tim Story's The Blackening. Yes. He actually zoomed in to talk to my class this last fall, and that was really great. And an inner city scientist tries to save her brother from violence in Bomani J. Story's The Black Girl and Her Monster. And if you haven't seen these, please do support. Black horror literature is thriving even more than Black film and television, including fiction, art, and essays by many of the panelists who will be here later today, including pioneer Jewel Gomez. I know the Gilder stories were just reissued recently. Artist and author John Jennings, Box of Bones, and many other works. Scholar Dr. Kenitra Brooks, Searching for Sycorax and Sycorax's Daughters. Ladarian Williams, newcomer with Blood at the Roots. Justin C. Key, another newcomer with The World Wasn't Ready for You. Tamika Thompson, Unshod, Cackling, and Naked, her connection. Michelle Tracy Berger's Doll Seed, which I saw her signing copies of earlier. And Haley Dennings' This Ravenous Fate. I hope I haven't left anybody out, but what a collection of artists just like in this room, like literally right now. There is no substitute for feeling seen in the genre you love, and readers and viewers are responding. And I would argue that horror fans overall are receptive to marginalized horror, because through the prism of specificity, we return to the universal. Horror from a new culture is novel, and I would argue scarier. And horror protagonists of all types, whether they're Black, Latinx, indigenous, queer, or all those things together, teach us both empathy and the obvious lesson that we are all human in the face of monsters. It's the same lesson W.E.B. Du Bois was trying to convey in his short story, The Comet, in 1920, where the last two survivors of a post-apocalyptic event in New York are a Black man and a white woman. And if you didn't know that W.E.B. Du Bois also wrote horror and science fiction, now you know. For Black people specifically, I think our love of horror, whether or not the characters are Black, is rooted in this desire to process and escape generational, racial, and economic trauma. I didn't realize it as a child, but I do think my mother's love of horror was directly related to that activism during the Civil Rights era in Florida, where those students, including my aunt, Priscilla Krause, spent 49 days in jail in Tallahassee after their arrest during this lunch counter sit-in. Until she died, she wore those dark glasses. And it really kept me from being able to see her eyes as I think of it now. Those same glasses are now at the Florida Archives. I think horror also appeals to fans in general as a balm for traumatic histories, events, and experiences, allowing us to confront real-life demons from a safe distance. The power of Black horror is its ability to visualize trauma, but through a fantasy prism. And I want to have a little aside now, as we're at this crossroads where Black horror is better known as a subgenre, and more people are trying to come to the Black horror party, as it were. But I think sometimes we forget that horror, first and foremost, is meant to be entertainment. It's horror from a safe distance. That's what makes it entertaining. There's nothing safe about watching someone get lynched or piled on by a racist mob. You can probably all think of examples of horror that veered into the territory of what some people might call trauma porn, right? I mean, I'm not gonna name names, I'm trying to work in this town, but y'all know what I'm talking about. Where that's supposed to be horror. Like the difference between the horrific and horror. And there's a difference. Like one you watch for fun and one you don't watch for. I mean, you can watch it, but you're not trying to watch it for fun. Like all monkey paw films, Nia DaCosta's rebooted Candyman rejects racist violence. I mean, there's a little bit of like police violence at the beginning especially, but in favor of fantasy storytelling. DaCosta uses an animation to depict the historical violence against Daniel Robitaille? I don't know. How do you pronounce his name? Y'all know. Robitaille, got it. Daniel, I'm looking over to the scholars in the corner. Robitaille, before he became Candyman, and the body horror is purely in the realm of fantasy. And the difference in that is that no one's grandmother has ever told them a story about being stung by a bee and then being transformed into a monster or an avenging angel, which, sorry, spoilers, it came out a few years ago if you haven't seen it, is what happens in the new Candyman. The fantasy element helps avoid re-triggering the Black audience, while at the same time embedding messages about Black Lives Matter and say their names. And that's what makes it entertainment. My mother never would have loved horror if a typical horror movie was about a racist mob breaking into your house to kill your child, which is an actual thing that happened in one of these projects I'm not mentioning by name. Now, make that racist mob a pack of zombies, a horde of demons, I can watch that all day. That did not ever happen to my family or anybody's family that we know of. They might remind me of the violence of a racist mob, and that's where that feeling seen, like it's like I think that's what my mother got from it. Like horrific things, horrifying things are real. These things really happen, and even though my experience wasn't zombies, I feel validated in that experience. But if it's too on the nose, it's too hard to do that. You want to have enough emotional distance to be entertained by the ride. Then you can relax and you can look for the lessons. How to fight back. Pick up a weapon to try to heal, to seek out survival behaviors in crisis, to face the worst and be able to walk away unscathed. Because unlike the demons in our real lives, it isn't real. By comparison, sometimes the real-life demons don't even seem quite as bad. Or sometimes horror is just the way to help us or others understand. And I will go back to Jordan Peele's Get Out. It's really kind of the epitome of a contemporary racialized horror story where racism literally is the monster, and all members of the audience, no matter what their race, are forced to empathize with a black male protagonist who is hunted and abducted by a white family. Within that simple premise, Peele layers in commentary on white liberalism, microaggressions, the history of slavery, the appropriation of black bodies, and on and on and on. Every quarter I teach it, I see something new. But black horror doesn't have to be about racism. In fact, if you have the Out There Screaming anthology or my Wishing Pool collection, not that many of the stories are actually about racism as the monster. It's just black artists expressing their view of what horror is, and again, back to the universal. My most recent novel, The Reformatory, I will admit, does happen to cast racism as the monster. And for whatever reasons, it's the most popular and well-awarded book I have ever written. And I've been publishing black horror since 1995. I am continually, like, when I look at Instagram, oh, by the way, TikTok's back already. What theater that is. What theater? Don't fall for the theater, folks. It's just another day on TikTok. But when I look at the reader responses to the book, and I mean all kinds of readers, it's just like I'm just so moved and overwhelmed by those responses. And it took me 7 years to write this book. It was the most difficult project I've ever worked on, longer than any of my other novels, or several of them combined, frankly. And it was inspired by my family, but it's also about a community that's a microcosm for this nation and its history of dehumanization, segregation, and Jim Crow. So the backstory for it is that back in 2013, really only months after we had buried my mother, I got a call from the Florida State Attorney's Office. Oddly, it was Pam Bondi's office, not her, but it was her office. And that was when, for the very first time, I learned that my mother had an uncle named Robert Stevens, who died in 1937 at the age of 15 at the Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida. The true life Robert Stevens, I'm sad to say, was stabbed to death by another inmate at Dozier, which is something I pay homage to in the novel. And if you've read it and you're like, why? That's why. That's why. I had never heard of the Dozier School for Boys, and the horrific, and by the way, I'm not giving away the ending of the book. Don't believe me. My whole point in writing The Reformatory was to give Robert a different story than the real story, so don't be afraid of that. But I had never heard of this facility, this horrific facility that operated between about 1900 and 2011 and was fraught with complaints from jump, like day one. They're shackling the children. They were flogging children when it was illegal in Florida to flog adult prisoners, but I guess it was okay to flog children. So many children died in the custody of this place that it had its own unmarked graves and a cemetery known as Boot Hill. And I never knew that my mother lost her uncle there. And I don't think she knew herself, to be honest. I've since met a namesake of Robert Stevens, another uncle of mine, who did not know for whom he was named. So it was as if this child was taken from this family and ripped a hole in this family that they tried to paper over by not naming him, by not maybe even as much as possible thinking about him. And I wanted everyone to know Robert Stevens' name so he would not be erased from the world. And I did go to Marianna soon after that call. I met survivors of the Dozier School, black and white, and from day one I knew I have to write a book about this evil-ass place. Oh, sorry if there are any kids here. This evil place. And I thought about doing it as nonfiction for a half a minute, but it's like, no, it's not a great story. It's not a great story for nonfiction. And honestly, there were so many memoirs by survivors of the Dozier School. I was like, they can tell the story of what happened to them. Let me write a novel about what happened to Robert Stevens. And my father, who's 90 years old, he calls himself a freedom lawyer, John Dorsey Due, Jr., also came along with me, as he would on several research trips over the years as I worked on this. And this was a way of turning our mourning of my mother into an act rather than simply an emotional state. And that's the other part of healing and horror, for those of you who write. It heals us. It's not just about being healed as the viewer or as the reader. It's about that process of healing we undergo as the creators that we hopefully try to pass on to you. Of course, I knew I was going to have to write it as a horror novel. And of course, there were going to have to be some ghosts. But it's also a bit of a bait and switch because, yeah, the haints, as I call them, and as Robert calls the spirits of the dead boys trapped at this facility, can be scary. One in particular is also a nuisance. But they're not the true monsters of the story. History is one of the monsters. Bureaucracy is one of the monsters. In the Reformatory, as in the True Life Dozier School for Boys, the monsters are human. And it was incredibly difficult to research because of those survivors and their experiences that when they were children. And this question would come up again and again. How could anyone treat children this way? But unfortunately, as many of you know, this grim story was not unique to the Dozier School. There's a whole podcast about the Alabama Industrial School for Negro Children. We've heard similar horror stories about indigenous schools in Canada, schools for pregnant girls in Ireland and elsewhere. Throughout history, children have far too often been abused by those with power over them, including their parents. The Stanford Prison Experiment explains why, because when we designate ourselves as the supervisors of others, there is something in our human nature that can veer toward dehumanization and abuse. Not everyone, not always, but far, far too often. So I wanted to write a story where Jim Crow Florida was the monstrous setting, not just the Reformatory, but the entire town that enabled it. I wanted to elevate the work of True Life Florida activists like Harry T. and Harriet Moore, who were killed when the Klan bombed their house on Christmas Day in 1951, predating what we know as the modern civil rights movement. And I wanted to tell a simple story of a 12-year-old boy who's determined to be free, and his 17-year-old sister who is determined to free him. If I ever wasn't sure what to write next, I only had to ask myself, what would Mom have done? That's why I named that character Gloria. That is my mother's middle name. When I wasn't sure what a civil rights attorney would say to a Jim Crow judge, my father helped me craft the scene in the judge's chamber based on his experience in the 1960s. Very literally, my parents helped me write this novel, and through writing this novel, I hoped to help both my father and I heal from our grief over the loss of our mother and the uncle she never knew about, and hopefully others might heal. Despite the weight of the research, I wanted the Reformatory to be a story about a family's love, a community's rebellion, and about children who find a way to preserve some joyful part of themselves despite the horror all around them, which, by the way, is a trait we are all going to have to get familiar with in the years to come. Do not let anyone steal our joy. We can't feel it all the time, but it can't be gone so long that we forget what it feels like. And of course, I had to add ghosts, because ghosts would pay homage to the true life violence at the Dozier School without forcing me to write a novel with constant depictions of violence against children. Only through a ghost story, I believed, could I create a novel with enough hope and enough healing to blunt the horror of history. And by adding ghosts and making this story horror, I believed, hopefully, this story could help us heal. I'll end my talk, if there's time, we can do Q&A. I'm happy to, with an anecdote about one of my signings in Georgia. It was a difficult day. I had started the day putting my dad on the phone with a Dozier survivor who was about his age, but the man who was in such trauma, and I didn't know him before. If I had, I would have incorporated his story in my research, but it was very late. He wrote a memoir with his daughter called It Still Hurts. And the very first words out of his mouth when he got on the phone with my dad was, "It still hurts." Now, he wasn't kidding. He was reliving the events and the trauma all the time. Man in his 80s, all the time. And as insidious as I thought the place was, he told me stories that were even more insidious than what I had written. So I was like, holy cow, this, I had to drink some tea, shake it off, get ready to go to my signing that evening. That evening, it was a big crowd. It was about this size. One of the last people in line was a youngish white man, about in his 40s, I would say. And he was shaking when he was standing next to me. And he told me, "I'm shaking." And I was like, oh, he is shaking. And I was actually a little concerned, to be honest. I didn't understand why he was shaking or why this moment was so momentous for him. And then he told me that he had been at the Dozier School in the 1990s. And it dawned on me that here in the same day, I had talked to two different men from different generations, different races, different backgrounds, who still carried the scars from that facility today. And again, my imposter syndrome was taking over. Wasn't my story to tell? Did I have a right to tell the story? And he looked at me and he said, "Thank you. Thank you for writing this book." And I like to think that it helped him heal. I know it did help me. So thank you very much.
We're going to have about 15 minutes of Q&A. I have two colleagues in the audience who have the mic, so raise your hand if you have a question that you would like to put forward.
And if you don't have a question, I'll just keep talking. But somebody, yes.
Do ghosts talk to you?
That is a great and fair question. Do ghosts talk to me? Not that I'm aware of, I have to admit. One of the traits I have found, and I don't know about this crew over here because maybe we're built different, but when I talk to other horror writers about their experiences, they really don't believe in the paranormal. They have not had any experience, like nothing, like almost really atheistic about it, which might explain why, because I had someone once tell me that if I really believed in it, I might not write some of the things I was writing. Now, that is not to say that I'm a disbeliever. I have had dreams that I have interpreted as visits, because I chose to interpret them that way. One about my late grandmother. She was standing outside of her closet door, and she said, "It's right here." She was pointing, and I was so excited to see her, I woke myself up from the dream. And I told my mother about it, and she said, "Oh, well, I did find a coat with about $120 in the pocket in that closet." And I said, "Mom, Mother is not going to travel across the plains to tell me about $120. And she said, "Oh, yes, she would." So maybe they do, but not that I'm aware. She's gonna.
What's your experience with writer's block, and how do you move past it?
What is my experience with writer's block, and how do I get past it? The Reformatory is a great example of what I think writer's block can be. Sometimes it's just fear, and also avoidance, fear of failure. I didn't like being in 1950. I didn't particularly care. I mean, I've heard other writers talk about not enjoying the act of writing. Octavia Butler sounded sometimes like writing was not the same fun for her that I feel like it is for me. And this was the first project where I had felt like it wasn't fun to write, that it was almost like a duty to write. And I found myself confronting what seemed to be writer's block. So a couple things can help. One is getting your mind right, maybe meditating, there are some things that you can do to try to calm the fear, if that's what it is. Sometimes writer's block to me is a lack of research. Like literally, it's like in the original Matrix where there's nothing but white space around Neo, and that's you as the author. You can't see the room because it's a historical. For me, if it's a historical, what's the furniture? What does a kitchen look like? I don't even know. So you have to plug in the research. But very often, I think it's just paralysis more than literally a block. The paralysis because you want it so much, and because you're comparing your first draft, your daily progress, to the great writers that you enjoy, who went through many, many, many editing processes before they were published. And we unfairly compare ourselves against people who were at a different point in the project. So that's how I confront writer's block. During COVID, that's what really kicked me into high gear with finishing the Reformatory, the notion that, oh my God, you could die before you finish this book. That became real. And once that became real, it really helped clear away a lot of the fog. I put up a chart on my wall so I could see how many pages I wrote a day. That's, that may be last resort for some of you, but honestly, having a quota and not being able to lie to myself about how much I had written that day or that week was very, like 0, 0, 0. I was like, oh, I'm not working. I'm telling people I'm writing this book, but I'm not really writing this book. So that's how I try to confront it. There's the emotional piece where you just need to be centered and not be afraid. There's the taskmaster part where you force yourself to find time in the creases. Like if you just have 20 minutes, maybe if you just have 20 minutes, just read over the last thing you wrote, like the last 5 pages you wrote, just to keep the embers hot, or warm at least, so that you can come right in, like the next time, however much time you need, maybe it's an hour to do a good writing session. The next time you have that hour, you don't have to spend the first half hour rereading, you're ready to go. I hope that's helpful. Good.
When did you first start writing? What was the subject matter?
When did I start writing and what was the subject matter? I love that question. Okay, I was 4, and it was called Baby Bobby, literally. It was like typing paper folded in half with little stick drawings and captions. Baby Bobby is drinking from his bottle. I've gotten a little better since then, but the last page I wrote, Baby Bobby is a book about a baby. The author is Tananarive Due. So I was announcing that I was an author. Now, in terms of like the real first thing I wrote, there were a lot of like science fiction stories, sneaking onto spaceships, having a talking cat. But I remember being very affected by Alex Haley's Roots. So I called myself, because I was about 11 when I read that. So I called myself writing my version of Roots. It was a middle passage story from the point of view of a little black girl called Lottie, Lottie, make us free. And I was handwriting it page after page, and that was my first attempt, I believe, to write a novel. I didn't finish it, but that was when I started to sort of move away strictly from speculative fiction toward history. And I think ever since then, I took a long detour where canon had taught me that a story was an epiphany that happens to a white man. So I had a long detour trying to write that, like all through college, until I came back to blackness and genre. It was a journey, but yeah, my first published book was The Between in 1995.
Have you had any opposition in your writing with publishers?
I feel like I have been very, very, very blessed on my publishing journey because, the short answer is not really. And I know that is not true for a lot of writers, so I almost feel guilty saying that. But the context is I started publishing in 1995. This was in the midst of the 90s Black arts boom. Like, we were seeing romantic comedies and mysteries as movies and in fiction. All of it was blowing up at the same time. So I was on the heels of Terry McMillan. And publishers were like, oh, shoot, Black people read? That was kind of the collective attitude. Y'all remember, some of you? So that was what I wasn't, I didn't come in as a horror writer. I came in as a Black writer. They didn't care if it was horror. All they were looking for was, is it commercial? Will it stick to the wall? And of course, it receded, like all things do. But I've just been very fortunate, I feel. But I will say that, one thing I will say, I think out of fairness to the fact that there is struggle out there, is that for me, being a full-time writer was my aspiration for a very long time. But I have since learned that I'm more comfortable with the job that I like. So I don't have to rely on gatekeepers to approve of my work, right? Like yeah, you want to publish it, but wanting to publish and having to publish are two very different things. And I really just didn't feel like it was fair to prop up my inner child on the corner to bring in, maybe not on the corner, but to prop up my inner child and send my inner child to work while my adult self is at home like, where's the money? So it's the opposite. I try to bring in the money and let my inner child write for. That's how I could take 7 years to work on the Reformatory. If I had needed that, I didn't even sell it beforehand. I wrote it on spec. So there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of having more Black people in publishing, people of color in general in publishing, finding those readers, but it's come a long way. It's like Steve and I published a novel, a young adult zombie novel called Devil's Wake that had a Black teen protagonist. And on the cover, they put a little white girl. That was such a random image that we literally had to write a scene to explain what the hell it had to do with the rest of the book. Like they're driving and they see a little girl on the road. Like we had to add that scene. And Steve had the experience of having white characters on his cover. Octavia had that experience. If you saw the original Dawn, they would put a white. So that's gotten a lot better now. That has gotten a lot better now. But there are still a lot of boxes that we get put into, and that it is still. I've been very lucky, but I know luck. I know it's not just that everything is great.
Kind of piggybacking on that question, since Black horror is a mask for a lot of white supremacy, have you found that with book bans and book challenges that Black horror has been a target of a lot of those challenges?
So far, I have not. I'm almost afraid to look on the lists and see if the Reformatory has been banned anywhere. Someone might know better than I do. It's something I'm expecting as years go on, that there will be more and more backlash to all kinds of literature and all kinds of art, not just horror in particular. But that has not been my experience thus far. That might be an interesting question for the panel later. So far, I haven't experienced the backlash that I've noticed. But I do expect it.
Hi. I was also raised on horror with my grandma, watching Chucky and Tales from the Crypt, and The Leprechaun when I was way too young. And what does conversations with children, when you talk about horror, what do those conversations for you look like?
How young are we talking?
Well, I feel like, my nephew's only 5, and he talks about all these scary things he sees on YouTube and stuff. So as young as 5, these conversations are being had. So what does that look like?
Well, it reminds me of what Rusty Cundiff, the director of Tales from the Hood, said in Horror Noir, that his father raised him as it's not dead people you have to worry about, it's the living, right? In terms of that. I think there are a lot of great resources now for younger children that we didn't have when I was coming up. One of my son's favorite books, the first book he ever asked us to read over and over again was Scary Stories to Read in the Dark, right? The one with the scarf and her head falls off and all that. It's pretty intense, but kids accept it. And I think that, fairy tales, especially the unvarnished fairy tales, are pretty grim, so to speak. See what I did there? And they serve the same function, which is gentle ways to explain to children, there are scary and bad things that happen in the world. And these things are not real. I don't know how much farther you want to take it. One day it will be real. It's not going to be a ghost. It's not going to be a zombie. But I think it's very, very important for us to find gentle ways to prepare our children for what the world is. Even if you really think about it, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, Merrily, merrily, merrily. Life is but a dream. That's the part we should have been paying attention to. Life is but a, guess what? Yes, that was so true. How fast does the time go by since the time you heard that song? Life is but a dream. That's horror, as far as I'm concerned. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It's just a matter of knowing what the world is that we live in. And I do think horror is a very healthy way to acclimate children, you know, with a reason. Maybe not The Exorcist or whatever the equivalent of it is now, but gentle ways. Children's horror, I think, is very important.
I wanted to know if there was any non-horror media, whether that be art or music or movies, that inspire your horror writing.
Oh, those are good. Okay, wow. This is completely random, so I'm just going to say the first thing that pops to my head. About 10 years ago, I started playing rock band with my family and discovered I was a drummer. And I said that because I got all the way through rock band on hard, and I treated myself to an electronic drum kit for Christmas this past year, which I intend to help as one of my tools to get through this damn year. Banging, like whether it's funk or rock or work my way up to jazz. Jazz, ooh, you know, it's a little complex, but yeah, I love music. I love music. I love all those genres I just mentioned. I particularly love historical music, going back to blues and jazz. You know, that music just reminds me that all the hell these people were going through during the time they composed this art. And they created such beauty out of it, such lasting beauty that can make us get up and dance with joy when they were catching hell. And I think that it's really important to remember that about Black art. Whether it's music or paintings or whatever, dance, I mean, all of it, all these Hollywood performers, Hattie McDaniel, everything they had to go through to try to bring their art out and give us some joy. So yeah, I mean, all of it. I don't know anything specific. There's so much. I'll just leave it at that. I'm into the drumming right now.
Well, thank you for that. That was our final question. Let's put our hands together for...
Thank you all.
Tananarive Due.
Thank you.